And now, not the story of a ghost train, but of a ghost tunnel. Hoosac in Native American roughly translates to pile of rocks. However, many have mistranslated it over the years as meaning forbidden thanks to the Hoosac Tunnel. Seemingly two very different things, a pile of rocks and being forbidden, but it's fair to say people started calling it the Forbidden Tunnel for a bloody good reason. Construction of the tunnel began in 1851 and started fairly slow. The rock was very hard and unyielding, so much progress wasn't made until the introduction of nitroglycerin into mining, with the Hoosac Tunnel being the first in the country to use nitroglycerin in its construction. Things were going fine until the 20th of March 1865, when three explosive experts named Ned Brinkman, Billy Nash and Ringo Kelly used nitroglycerin to progress their section of tunnel. As they set the nitro and ran back to the safety bunker, Ringo made it to the bunker first, and rather than wait for the others, he set off the charges early, burying Brinkman and Nash alive under the falling rock. After the accident, Ringo vanished without a trace, leading many to think it was an intentional act of murder. Whether it was just an accident or not is still unknown. Some accounts of the story says it was 10 days later when Ringo showed up again. Others say it was a year later. Either way, he was eventually found, with workmen discovering his corpse 2 miles deep into the tunnel where Brinkman and Nash had died. Ringo had been strangled to death, and the police deduced that he had died around 3:30 in the morning. No suspects were ever found and the crime remains unsolved. Rumours started to circulate among the construction crew that the vengeful spirits of Brinkman and Nash had lured Ringo back into the tunnel to kill him. As such, some men started to believe that the tunnel was cursed and left the digging site, with other men flat out refusing to enter, especially after dark. In 1868, an engineer and respected officer during the Civil War named Paul Travers received a letter from Mr. Dunn, the man in charge of the tunnel project, in the hopes that Travers would investigate it after workmen started to complain of hearing a man's voice cry out in agony. Progress had slowed down because of this. Dunn was convinced that it was just the wind, but the men wouldn't listen, so he hoped a visit from Travers would put them right. Travers and Dunn entered the tunnel at 9 PM on the 8th of September. Travers wrote a letter to his sister afterwards recalling the event of that evening. Dunn and I entered the tunnel at exactly 9 PM. We travelled about 2 miles into the shaft when we stopped to listen. As we stood there in the cold silence, we both heard what truly sounded like a man groaning out in pain. As you know, I have heard this same sound many times during the war, yet when we turned up the wicks on our lamps, there were no other human beings in the shaft except Mr. Dunn and myself. I'll admit, I haven't been this frightened since Shiloh. Mr. Dunn agreed that it wasn't the wind we heard. Perhaps Nash and Brinkman? I wonder. Work continued until a month later when the worst accident in its construction took place. A gas explosion blew up the water pumping station on the surface, which killed 13 miners after the debris filled the tunnel they were working in. A miner was lowered into the shaft in an attempt to find any survivors, but was brought back to the surface a few minutes later, barely conscious from the fumes, only able to gasp, "No hope," to the rescue team. As the shaft started to fill with water, some of the bodies floated to the surface. The last body wasn't found until over a year later. During the year the bodies were still missing, local villagers told tales of vague shapes and muffled wails coming from the water-filled pit. Workmen claimed to see the lost miners carrying picks and shovels through the mist and snow of the mountaintop. The ghosts would appear and vanish, leaving no footprints in the snow and not answering to calls. Strangely, after the last body was found and properly buried, the apparitions stopped appearing, although the eerie moans coming from the tunnel continued to keep workmen terrified. A man by the name of Dr. Clifford J. Owens visited the tunnel on the 25th of June 1872, accompanied by James R. McKinstry, a drilling superintendent. It's not known exactly why the two visited the tunnel, but it was likely a shared interest in the ghost stories surrounding it. As they both reached 2 miles deep into the tunnel, they stopped to rest. The only lights in the tunnel were their dimmed lanterns. Dr. Owens described the place as being as cold and as dark as a tomb. As they were talking and resting, they heard a strange and mournful sound that Dr. Owens described as sounding like someone in great pain. He then said, "The next thing I saw was a dim light coming along the tunnel in a westerly direction. At first I believed it was probably a workman with a lantern. Yet, as the light grew closer, It took on a strange blue colour and appeared to change in shape into the form of a human being with no head. The light supposedly got close enough for them to touch it, staying motionless for a moment as if it was watching them before it continued toward the east end of the tunnel, eventually vanishing. Dr. Owens later stated that he was, above all, a realist, and that he was not prone to repeating wild tales and gossip that defied reasonable explanation, but he admitted he was unable to deny what he and McKinstry saw that night. In 1874, close to the tunnel's completion, a local hunter named Frank Webster vanished near the mountain. 3 days later, he was found by a search party, in a state of shock, mumbling incoherently and stumbling along the banks of the Deerfield River. When he came to his senses, he explained that strange voices had ordered him into the Hoosac Tunnel, and that once inside, he saw ghostly figures wandering around. He then said that invisible hands had snatched his hunting rifle and beat him with it. He was found with injuries matching that of a beating. Webster said he didn't remember leaving the tunnel. Later the same year, both tunnel headings were completed, and by the 9th of February 1875, the first train went through the tunnel. The news called the tunnel the Western Gateway to the rest of New England, but eerie things still went on. In the fall of that year, a fire tender was taking a wagon load of wood into the tunnel when he suddenly turned his team and horses around and rushed them out. The team and wagons were later found in the forest, but the fire tender was nowhere to be seen. For years, stories of ghosts and mysterious goings-on surrounded the tunnel, although the ghosts weren't always malicious. An employee of the railroad named Joseph Impoco frequently worked around the tunnel and was moving ice away from the tracks one day when a voice called to him, "Run, Joe, run!" He turned to see an engine rapidly approaching him, just managing to jump out of the way. When he tried to see who shouted his name, he saw nobody, and noted that the engine was too loud and too far away for it to have been the driver calling to him. 6 weeks after the incident, he was using a crowbar to free some freight cars that were frozen to the tracks, when the same voice frantically called out, "Joe, Joe, drop it, Joe!" He immediately let go of his crowbar as it was suddenly thrown against the wall of the tunnel. It turned out a power line had overheated and shorted out, causing more than 11,000 volts to be sent through the rails. Joe soon left his job and took up work outside of the area, but visited the tunnel every year as an homage to the ghost that had saved his life. He was certain that if he didn't do it, some tragedy would befall him. In 1977, his wife fell ill, and so he decided to stay at home with her instead of visiting the tunnel as he usually would do. His wife died in October of that year, and he believed she died because he had failed to visit the tunnel. In 1976, a paranormal researcher visited the tunnel and claims to have come face to face with a figure of a man in old-fashioned working clothes, backlit by a brilliant white light. In 1984, another researcher entered the tunnel with a railroad official, saying she felt the uncomfortable sensation of someone standing close to her the whole time. Another group of students left a tape recorder in the tunnel overnight, and when reviewing the recordings, said they heard what seemed to be muffled human voices. Strange sights and eerie feelings still surround the tunnel to this day. Despite this, it is still heavily used by the Boston and Maine Railroad. Overall, over 200 men died digging the 4.7-mile tunnel, which took 25 years to complete. The tunnel earned the nickname of the Blood Pit, and still to this day remains as one of the most haunted places in the US. So even though its name only means pile of rocks, I feel like Forbidden is a lot better fitting, mostly because the tunnel has certainly earned that name. Subscribe for more.